Hi, this is Kevin Trainer, and welcome to my briefing for Chapter 10 of the Pinkham book, Django Unleashed. And Chapter 10 is called Revisiting Migrations. And, up until this point, we've had a pretty distant relationship with migrations. You'll recall that migrations are the mechanism that keep a coordination between the model code that we have in our Django apps and the schema and the schema of our relational database, and the data that's in the relational database as well. Okay, um, we learn how to do two things in the chapter. One is a data migration, and he does a whole bunch of them, but we're only going to practice one when we get to our tutorial part. And the other is a schema migration. And we're going to do one of those two in our tutorial part. So the thing to remember here is that migrations don't change any code in the Django model. Okay, it's a little tempting to think that they do, because the code that goes into a migration looks suspiciously like the model code in models.py. And that's just because it's a convenient notation to use. So what you have to remember here is that we make all the changes in the Django code in models.py ourselves. Okay, we code them by hand. And then, if we're lucky, if we're doing a change that's pretty straightforward, like we're just adding a table, well, then we can get it to generate the migration pretty much all for us and not have to add a lot of custom code into the migration. If, on the other hand, we're doing something fancy, like we're changing the schema in a trickier way that's going to imply some kind of a conversion, well, then we're going to have to not only code all the changes in the model code by hand, but we're going to have to code a lot of the migration code by hand too. Now, it kind of helps us that again, the syntax for the migration code and the syntax for the model code are very close to each other, in some cases identical. But it really helps to keep track of what's going on. Okay? Let's see. So he begins by showing us a data migration. Okay? And he does a data migration for the tag model class. Okay? And he shows us how to do that. Let's see what we can find here. First of all, he shows us the code for creating a migration file that is empty. Okay, it's just a shell. It's not truly empty. It has some shell code in it. Okay, and that would give us the opportunity to add some code to it. And when we do that, we get a generated file name that's not very helpful. Okay, it's helpful that it keeps a track of the sequence of the migration, because that's very important. but this generated name is not very helpful. Now, he has us live with the generated name for a while. He actually has us change the generated name. It turns out that we learn a little bit later, so he eventually keeps the sequence 0002, and then he calls the rest of it tag data. Okay. In a later version of this, he shows us that there's a way to get control of the name when you generate the shell, the empty, quote unquote, empty migration file. So the second one he has us do for the startup data, he uses this empty option, but then he uses the name option. So he says, oh, he wants it to be called startup underscore data. And of course, you have to tell it the app that you're in. And it generates a file in the migrations folder called 0003 startup data. So that's the approach that we're going to be taking the whole time with our work. Yeah, we could do it by hand, but we don't want to do it by hand. So what do these things look like? What does the code look like inside these? Well, there's some important parts. As long as I'm down here, I'll show you here. There's this, there's the code that is inside of, well, I guess we're going to have to back up. We want the code that is inside of the migration class. So there's a migration class, and one of the things that is in it is this list of operations. Okay, and if all we're doing is a data migration, then we have a simple operation. I think there are 16 or 14 possible operations that you can do. The simplest of these is a run Python, which essentially runs a conversion. And here are the name of two functions that are going to be in the same package. So they're going to be in the file with this migration class. And one does the migration or the conversion in a forward direction. It's called add tag data. And the other one does it in a reverse direction, remove tag data. And so we've got that. The other code that we have in migration is the dependency. Now, I was showing you that code down here in a little bit. The dependency says that in this app, okay, what is the name of the migration that has to be run before you can run this? Okay. These are organized, in this case, in a simple chain. So before you can run 003, you have to run 002. If you go and open up 002, it's going to have a dependencies in it, and it's going to say before you can run 002, you have to have run 001. Okay, so when we generate this file, it automatically puts the code in for the dependencies. So when we generate this, it automatically generates the right sequence number for the new file, in this case, this 003 startup data, and it automatically gives the proper file name for the dependency 002 tag data, which is pretty cool. Okay, and then again, we've got the single operations. It's migrations package run Python. And there are two functions that we have to supply. And the functions that we have to supply generally in the design that he teaches work off a list, okay? And each, it's a list of dictionaries, okay? So each dictionary has the basic data in it to generate a row of the table. Okay, so this is startups. So each dictionary on the list has enough information to create a row in startups. Okay, and it's a typical dictionary where we have the name of the field, and we've got the value that we want to populate it with. Okay, now why is this called startups in all caps? Well, because we don't expect it to change. It's not a changeable variable. It's something that we see as a constant, and people will sometimes use the convention. In fact, it's a good convention of naming constants in all caps. Okay, so each of these dictionary entries is enough to populate a single row, and then in the add startup data, let's see where we had some code for one of those before. Add tag data. Here's this. So we have to get reference to the model class. We do it in a slightly different way here than we do it in, say, the view code, which we do it with an import, but we get the job done. And then we go through that. List of data that we want to load. And as we go through the list, we call create. And we pass a value to create for each of the fields that we want to create. And these have a one-to-one correspondence with the dictionary fields. Right? And then we do the opposite with the remove. We go around and we do the remove. Okay, so a data migration like this, he says, is good for loading test data. And I guess it is, but typically in migrations, certainly schema migrations, you have this idea that you would use it in your development environment to migrate your schema there, and provided that you're able to make that work, then you would go and apply the migration on your production server. I don't know why you would want to apply test data migrations on your production server. So it's a little bit odd the way he does it. In the approach that we take in our tutorial, we're using it to load up semester data, which is a kind of infrastructure. You know, we want the semesters for spring, summer, and fall 2017, spring, summer, and fall 2018, 2019, and 2020. And so this is a data that we're going to want to load both on our development server and on our production server. So we don't have the kind of questionable use case that he has at this point in the chapter. So that's how you do a data migration. The thing to remember is that they can run forward or backward. Okay? What is kind of interesting there is that you have to have the two functions, the add and the remove, and typically, if you can find the stuff that the entries that you've added, if you've given them distinct values, then you should be able to find them to delete them on the way back out. Okay, now lower down in the chapter, he shows us how to do a more complex schema migration. Okay, and he has us do this with news links. Okay. And the interesting thing that he kind of shows us, and let me see if we can find that. Where are we? Oh, right up here. The problem in schema migrations is that there's a whole conversion that has to be done. For instance, if you are adding a column, then you have to populate it. Okay, so and then when you add a column, if you add a column to a table that has existing rows, it has to know how to populate that column, if only temporarily, before you write the conversion code that's going to populate it. So as you see here, you're going to want to have a default value that tells it, in this case, to put in a null. Okay, but you're not going to want to keep that around. Okay, because you don't want to have a default value of a null. You want it to require a proper value. So it turns out that these schema migrations have they're sort of a dance. Okay, so we tell it to add a column, and when we tell it to add a column, we tell it to allow a null default value, and then we run the conversion code, the add and the remove, and then we change the schema and say, oh, by the way, it doesn't have a default. And so there's this dance that goes on that you can kind of see. Let's see if we can get down into a longer part of this. He only shows you a little bit at a time, unfortunately. Okay, but it's if you look at the operations, we add a field, we run Python code, we change a field, we add another field, we run Python code, we change a field. There's a bunch of operations in a row. It's an intricate dance that not only changes the schema, but it moves it through even intermediate states that facilitate the conversion. Okay, so it's pretty interesting stuff, and we have quite a bit of fun with this when we do our tutorial. Okay, so the tutorial's fun, if I do say so myself. That's it for my briefing. I'll talk to you again soon.